This hearing is called to order. I'm looking at the title of the hearing, Jihad 2.0, Social Media in the Next Evolution of Terrorist Recruitment. Unfortunately, I think that's a wrong title. It's really the current evolution of terrorist recruitment. We've got a panel of, I think, some excellent witnesses to lay out the reality, which is what we're always trying to do in this committee is if you're going to solve a problem, you have to first recognize, acknowledge that reality. And so I think we've got a good panel. I'd ask consent to enter my written opening statement in the record. And it's always granted because our ranking member is such a kind gentleman. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about a ISIS message that warns of 71 trained soldiers in 15 U.S. states, 23 signed up for missions. And I'm just going to read some excerpts in here because, first let me say we have no knowledge whether this is true or not. I think some of our witnesses will probably say it's bluster. Let's hope so. But this is a perfect example of what ISIS is trying to do and how they're trying to use social media. Their post, and of course this is claiming credit for the terrorist attacks in Texas. Excerpts read, "The attack by the Islamic State in America is only the beginning of our efforts to establish a province in the heart of our enemy. We knew that the target was protected. Our intention was to show how easy we give our lives for the sake of Allah. Out of the 71 trained soldiers, 23 have signed up for missions like Sunday. We are increasing in number. Of the 15 states, 5 we will name: Virginia, Maryland, Illinois, California, and Michigan. The disbelievers who shot our brothers think that you killed someone untrained. Nay, they gave their bodies in plain view because we were watching." They go on to say the next 6 months will be interesting. Let's hope not. As I'm being briefed for this hearing, and by the way, the reason we always call these hearings is I got questions. I need to understand what these problems are. But so I'm always learning a lot, and I'm going to learn a lot more through the testimony, but I like timelines. And so I had my staff prepare just for 2015 the timeline of potential terrorist plots that have been foiled, the arrests that we've been made by individuals who have been inspired by ISIS and other Islamic terrorists. And you go through the list. We had Christopher Lee from Cincinnati, Ohio, was planning to come to the U.S. Capitol to bomb, and then with 2 semi-automatic weapons, open fire on people fleeing the Capitol. That was on January 14th. February 25th, 3 Brooklyn men were arrested. March 17th, a former U.S. Air Force veteran was arrested after a failed attempt to cross the border into Syria. March 25th, an Army National Guard specialist was arrested after planning to travel to Syria. April 2nd, 2 women were arrested in Queens, New York. April 3rd, a Philadelphia woman was arrested before she could travel to Syria. April 8th, this one hits a little bit closer to home because this is a gentleman from, not gentleman, a man from Madison, Joshua Ray Van Haften, was arrested in Chicago O'Hare Airport after his flight landed from Turkey. April 10th, John T. Book was arrested in Topeka after it was discovered he was preparing a car bomb for use against nearby Fort Riley Army post. April 16th, another indictment. April 19th, 6 men arrested on terrorism charges. April 3rd, the Texas terrorist attempt. We've got a chart that I think is also somewhat surprising. So again, the point of that timeline is these arrests, the revelations of these things are growing, and they're increasing in frequency. Another, I thought, relatively shocking, as I was being briefed by my staff, I was saying, is this true? That the number of terrorist attacks in 2012 around the world was 6,771, and in 2013, 9,700? And one of my staff members went, wow, which was exactly my reaction. 2012, 11,000 individuals killed in terrorist attacks. It grew by 61% to almost 18,000 in 2013. Now, in this chart, we've also broken that out between terrorist attacks in Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, and Pakistan. I guess I'd consider those war zones. But that still leaves almost 3,000 terrorist attacks in 2012 outside of those war zones, almost 4,000 in 2013, an increase of about 33.8%. So the point of this hearing is to show that the danger is real. In many respects, the threat is growing. And we're going to have testimony here that there actually been some setbacks for ISIS. They're maybe not as strong as they purport to be, but they're using social media to prepare, to show that they're actually stronger than they are, to inspire the kind of action. And they don't need a whole lot of territory. They don't need too many computers. They don't need too many people spewing that hate and provide that kind of information or inspiration. So this is a real threat. I really want to thank and welcome the witnesses for your thoughtful testimony and coming here. And with that, we'll turn it over to our ranking member for his opening comments.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gartenstein-Ross. We may not have that rapid communication response capability of the federal government, but I tell you, I think most elected officials who've gone through a campaign, particularly presidential campaigns, have that within the political world, a rapid response. And maybe that'd be a good little piece of legislation we could propose as a rapid response communication team. We can pull them from campaigns. So trust me, we've got those capable individuals within our knowledge base. I would like to talk about the online process. I'd like to ask a question. So ISIS is using social media to connect and to talk. And by the way, I would like to enter into the record without objection the web pages provided by Mr. Shaikh. If you haven't read them, read them. It's pretty powerful in terms of the examples of how ISIS is using the social media. But what's the next step after that? Maybe Mr. Berger, whoever's more expert at talking about this. So they recruit, they talk online, and then what happens?
So there is a series of stages that you go through with this. Typically, somebody's exposed to their propaganda that's being broadcast out. When they take an interest in this, and this isn't just ISIS, this is how social media works generally. You find a subject, you take an interest in it, and when you start following it online, you see that there are other people talking about the same subject, and you start conversing with them. So what we'll typically see is that there will be a period where somebody is consuming this stuff in the public, and if somebody is seriously interested and willing to take a step further, or consider a step further, they will take it to a private format. So that can be a direct message on Twitter, which can't be read in the open source, or on Facebook. More often, they'll go to an encrypted app such as WhatsApp or Kik, which allows you to, it's basically text messaging with an element of encryption.
So again, our authorities can follow the open source social media, but the minute those individuals who are really serious about it go offline, we go dark. We lose our capability of following that, and we really have no idea. Is that basically correct?
Well, you can approach it with subpoena and other authorities. So I mean, it is possible to get there.
If we can decrypt.
Source, yes.
I mean, that's part of the problem. Is and obviously Silicon Valley is resistant to allowing us to decrypt, and even if they were to allow it, there will be other sites offshore that will also decrypt. So we are losing our capability of being able to follow this.
Yes, I would also just add, though, that, I mean, the ability of government to follow it on open social media is often murky.
Very limited.
People in different agencies have different understandings of what they're legally allowed to do when it comes to monitoring the communications of Americans, even on open social media platforms, and that's somewhere where a government-wide initiative to clarify authorities would be very helpful.
It wasn't in your testimony, but in my prep, apparently you'd have a publication where your best guess was there were 46,000, I think these are your words, overt ISIS supporter accounts on Twitter, maybe a number of 90,000. Can you describe what you're talking about by an overt ISIS supporter account?
Sure. That figure was from late last year, so it's much smaller now, significantly smaller.
But no, why is that? That's
because Twitter has started aggressively suspending accounts. So an overt ISIS supporter, for the criteria we used for the paper, was that the person, we had a series of steps. So first, if you're just like tweeting ISIS propaganda and I love ISIS all day long, then you're an ISIS supporter. If you're not doing that in an obvious way, then we looked at who you followed and then who followed you and sort of analyzed the network to try and see if there was a clear case. So it was a very conservative approach to coding somebody as a supporter. But it's fundamentally somebody who's not actively trying to conceal their interest in ISIS.
So Mr. Shaikh is somebody who's trying to prevent young girls, for example, or other people that are making those connections. Where are they going now then? Is there an alternative?
Well, they will remain in the orbit of their particular networks. What I try to do is engage them openly and directly online. I've seen others try to do that as well. In fact, you're seeing people even on the Al-Qaeda side, strangely, arguing against ISIS types, making theological arguments, which is kind of strange considering they're Al-Qaeda. But they will continue to orbit their networks. Those that do go off into the WhatsApp and KIK, I don't follow them offline into that, but that is what they do.
There are officials of the U.S. government going into Muslim communities, talking. And one of the reports we got back, and I was very surprised to hear this, is because of the revelations of Edward Snowden, that there seems to be a perception in America that the federal government knows all, and we have perfect knowledge, and we know exactly who's online, we know exactly who's on these sites and is becoming radicalized. And the members of those communities were actually very surprised that we had no idea. Can you kind of speak to that, Mr. Shaikh, in terms of the necessity of members of different communities to be policing themselves and reporting that? From DHS, it's if you see something, say something.
Yeah, I think I think Hollywood has kind of done this as well. That given the idea that the intelligence services are omnipresent and all-knowing. Maybe in some cases that's a good thing that people think that we can see everything. Of course, on the other hand, this is something that the government agencies are trying to achieve, get into the communities and give them something by which they can actually convince their own communities outside of law enforcement that, look, these are things that you need to watch for. These are your kids being lured over by these individuals. These are your parents that are going to end up in front of TV cameras as they attend court or whatever it is. These are your mosques that are going to see, press and retaliatory attacks and things like that. So it's an ongoing challenge with the communities. There's a level of mistrust, and there's this, there are professional naysayers, community organizations that are trying to obstruct and are very obstructionist in the way they approach this. But this is it's an issue that is continues to play out.
My final question really springs from a very interesting article written by Graham Wood in The Atlantic, and really, I think, amplified by your testimony, the significance of the territory held and the caliphate established, and how that is driving the process, driving the narrative. Perhaps you'd like to speak to that, Mr. Bergen.
I think the short answer is that's completely true. Without the territory, the claim to be the caliphate, if you don't control population, they control about 8 to 9 million people. It's the population of Switzerland. If you don't control territory, it's the size of the United Kingdom, roughly. Your claim to be the caliphate disappears, which has an important strategic implication, which is we need to keep chipping away or demolishing this caliphate.
But again, what does that inspire in the minds in the hearts of followers? I mean, what is the call? What is required once the caliphate is established?
Well, I think the call, and this is where it gets complicated, and it goes a little bit to what Mubin was talking about. For some highly observant, ultra-fundamentalist Muslims, they may feel, hey, I want to go and just be supportive. That doesn't necessarily mean I want to go and become a fighter for ISIS. And so I think as a matter for the law enforcement community and the Congress to think about, if somebody is not actually indicted for a potential act of terrorism, but merely for trying to go to Syria, we should be thinking about off-ramps that aren't 15 years in prison. Because right now, the problem that Muslim families have is if they see a son or daughter radicalizing and then they say, well, should we call the FBI? Well, then that son or daughter may get 15 years in prison. So I think we should think about, in Minneapolis, as you know, sir, there is a case where something other than a very long-term prison term for a 19-year-old young man is now in process, and I think it's a model we should be thinking about going forward.
Before I turn it over to the ranking member, anybody else want to respond to that?
I think that this also speaks to what Mubin had mentioned, which is the debate between al-Qaeda and ISIS supporters online. The reason why al-Qaeda had never declared a caliphate is because they didn't think that they could create something that would have staying power. So if the caliphate gets chipped away geographically, you'll see much more within jihadist circles, people attacking the decision to declare the caliphate in the first place, which is one reason why, as I said, they're susceptible to a brand reversal, because jihadists themselves would turn on them if they start to lose the territorial advantage. As to your question about what is required, for someone who believes that the caliphate has been legitimately declared, declared. If they don't accept the caliphate's authority, then they die in a state of sin. This is actually also gets to one of the intra-jihadist debates as to whether it's legitimate caliphate. But for people who support it, as was outlined, it can be anything from going over there and living in the caliphate, and that certainly is a pull, to for those who aren't able to do so, or those who are more well situated to carry out attacks, doing so at the home front. That's also one reason they've been so successful compared to other organizations in having a prompt to action. They have a lot of things going for them right now that make them acting essentially from a position of strength and within their very small target audience from a position of religious legitimacy.
So one of the goals of U.S. policy should be to deny them that territory, deny them that caliphate.
I think so, yes. And also to make sure that those losses are being broadcast, because it has a magnifying effect, being broadcast from multiple actors, including civil society activists. Essentially, as we improve our communications capabilities, one thing it does is it allows those who are opposed to ISIS to have a better vehicle to attack ISIS with.
Thank you. I apologize to the committee members for going over time. I thought that was important. Senator Carper. We'll start another round.
Thank you, Chairman.
I started my opening statement with description of that posting with the claim that there are 71 trained fighters, 23 have accepted assignments. Again, nobody knows whether that's bluster or whether it's real. I guess I will ask the question: is that an unprecedented posting? Have we seen similar things like that? Similar threats that simply haven't panned out? Anybody?
I think we have multiple times, and I'll give you an example. You know, do you remember the blackout on the East Coast? I think it was in 2005. Some jihadi group claimed credit. So, I mean, merely because they say something doesn't mean it's true.
What about from ISIS, though? I mean, recently? Or is that kind of unprecedented from ISIS?
No, it's pretty precedented. The volume of material they put out is just truly extensive, and it comes in a lot of different formats. So they've made a variety of threats with greater, more or less specificity over time. One of the reasons that that was surprising about the Garland event was that it was something that they had actually specifically talked about that then turned into an attack, and that's pretty unusual because they create so much noise that needle in the haystack can be very difficult to detect.
So you really take that posting with a great deal of skepticism?
Yeah.
It's the attempt at a winning message.
Yeah, I think that, certainly they have, dozens to low hundreds of passive supporters in this country, and some of those people may be prepared to act, but I don't think there's anything remotely as organized as what that post described.
Mr. Gartenstein-Ross, certainly in your testimony and in both written and oral, you were talking about the rise of the brand of ISIS, but they're also very vulnerable to a reversal of that. I certainly hope that's true. I also understand strategically they have made a lot of enemies, and they're being attacked on a number of different fronts. The stated goal of this administration of America right now is to degrade and ultimately defeat ISIS. I've asked administration officials in the past, what does defeat look like? I mean, define it. I'd like to have you gentlemen take a crack at what does defeat look like to you, and how achievable is that? I'll start with you, Mr. Gartenstein-Ross.
I think there's actually a very clear thing that defeat means in this context, which isn't true of other jihadist groups. They have staked their legitimacy to the caliphate's continuing viability. And if the caliphate is no longer viable, then they can lose legitimacy pretty quickly. So I think that if you're able to make the caliphate no longer a viable entity, no longer perceived as a viable entity, then at that point they have, in effect, lost. Now, their narrative won't be completely dead. If you understand the nuances of their narrative and the end times arguments of it, they have certain outs. That, for example, they believe that at some point there'll be a grand battle and they actually will be crushed. But what essentially it means is that you make this already marginal movement much, much more marginal. And let me actually add one final thing, because this ties into the way we're conceptualizing community and lone wolves. Sometimes we talk about what can the community do to delegitimize the message. The way I would think of it is, what can the community do to continue to delegitimize the message? Because for the United States, if we had a 5% approval rating, we would think that was an awful thing. For ISIS, they can have a 5% approval rating, and that's a great thing for them because they're dealing with those who are very much on the margins. They're not even dealing with the whole jihadist movement. There are many within the jihadist movement who argue against ISIS. So the question really is not how do we change an entire community, but how do we stop this fringe group from spurring people to action? And that's why this legitimacy of the caliphate actually will, in my view, have a disproportionate impact on their ability to remain viable as a movement.
Does anyone else have a different definition of defeat?
I think that we're best served by strategies that encourage ISIS to fail on its own terms. In cutting it off economically, an internal collapse or a major schism inside the group, I think would be better for us than a forcible ejection from their territory, especially if that ejection was done primarily through American military.
But that's the method. The defeat, I mean, how it looks like is the denial of that territory, the end of the caliphate, correct?
Oh, yeah. Well, it's the end of their territory, but it's not the end of the story. I mean, they already have branches and robust presence in Nigeria and Libya. Yeah, I mean.
An important point. I'm glad you pointed that out. Again, anybody else have a different definition of defeat? So then my next question is, I'm no military expert, and I don't think we have one on the panel, no offense. You have expertise that has been very valuable here. How far away are we from that definition of defeat?
As you said, I don't think anyone on this panel can say, but I can point to a few things we should look to. Number one, looking to internal resistance movements is very important. I agree with JM with JM Berger that at the end of the day, if the defeat comes from within, that's going to be a much more resounding defeat. Now, I should.
But how possible is that?
We already see resistance movements in some areas. Now, the question is how. Well, there's two things to this. Number one is how robust are they? In the past, we saw very robust resistance movements to AQI, but the U.S. also played a role in helping to ensure that they weren't destroyed. The second thing I should warn is I think a lot of these resistance movements are also people we don't like. You have, on the one hand, probably Ba'athist resistance movements, and I would say almost certainly you have al-Qaeda resistance movements, which plays into the broader struggle within jihadism. But that being said, looking to internal dissent, looking to, number two, internal squabbles. There was a question before about Baghdadi, and while I think that Baghdadi is replaceable, once you have a succession, especially within an organization like this, which has a cult of personality internally, that might cause some greater fragmentation within ISIS, which could be a good thing in terms of the defeat of ISIS specifically. And the final thing we could look to is, given that they're a bit overstretched militarily, you could possibly see rapid reversals, just like when the U.S. engaged in its campaigns early in the Iraq War, in the Afghanistan War, and also even in Libya. There were very rapid reversals of the enemy that was trying to hold territory. It is hard to hold territory, particularly when your population is not particularly happy with what you're doing.
I do have a remaining second, so I just have to ask this question. Mr. Shaikh, talking about engagement with communities, understanding probably local police, all the better, but it's, how do you have a coordinated effort? But how do we find more Mubin Sheikhs? How do we find more people like you that have had a change of heart and that have your capacity and your capability and your willingness to really appeal and try and turn people away from this?
Oh, I wish we could clone me. I mean,
so I think we all do as well.
I tried to do the right thing. I got here because I believe I did make the right decisions, and it came at a lot of personal cost. I'll be honest, and I think a lot of people may not be ready to do that. I think when we say empowerment, I think it needs to be made clear for a lot of these individuals who are back, and really the intelligence community knows who these people are. After they've been vetted, and maybe they need to have continual monitoring, but to have them step up, go to Muslim conferences, let them be seen on media, mainstream media, where people hear the message. I don't want to be the only person. A lot of times I feel frustrated. I see, I'm the only guy doing it. Everyone's talking about counter messaging. Nobody's really doing enough of it. But there are others like me out there. They just don't know how to come forward, and so they will need some direction to do that.
Well, I think I speak for all of us when I say God bless you for what you're doing, Senator Carper. And again, I'm very serious. We need to work on this, and I certainly want to engage the members of the panel and other experts you can put us in touch with in terms of how do we do this? How do we set up a center of excellence? Is it inside government, outside of government? Do you fund it? Whatever. We need to work on this.
I suspect it's both.
Yeah, I agree. But again, it's urgent, like you said. One thing I do like to do is provide the witnesses a final bite at the apple here. If there's something that you want to get off your chest, final statement. I'd start with Mr. Bergen.
Looking for
Having come from a manufacturing background to solve a lot of problems, there's a process. It starts with laying out the reality, understanding exactly what it is, then set yourself achievable goals. I think today's hearing has certainly laid out a reality here that I wish weren't true. I wish we didn't have to face it, but we can't keep our head buried in the sand. So again, I just want to thank the witnesses for your thoughtful testimony, your thoughtful answers to questions. Mr. Shaikh, again, thank you for doing what you're doing. Thank you all for doing what you're doing. This hearing record will remain open for 15 days until May 22nd at 5 p.m. for the submission of statements and questions for the record. This hearing is adjourned.